If you were alive on October 26, 1958, you witnessed something that would change the world forever. That night, as darkness fell over New York's Idlewild Airport, 111 passengers walked across a red carpet and climbed aboard a gleaming silver Boeing 707. They had no idea they were about to experience something that would shrink the entire world, that would make distant continents feel as close as neighboring states, and turn the vast Atlantic Ocean into something you could cross in the time it took to enjoy dinner and a movie. But here's what most people don't know about that historic night. The real story wasn't just about speed. It wasn't just about crossing the ocean faster than ever before. The real revolution, the one that would change everything about how we live, work, and dream, was about something far more profound. And by the end of this story, you'll understand exactly what that was, and why it mattered so much more than anyone realized at the time. This is the story of how the jet age didn't just change travel, it changed us. And if you remember those days, or if you've ever wondered what it was really like when the world suddenly got smaller, this is a journey back to one of the most remarkable moments in modern history. To truly understand what happened on that October night in 1958, we need to go back just a little bit further. We need to remember what air travel was really like before jets came along. In the mid-1950s, if you wanted to fly from New York to Paris, you'd board a propeller-driven aircraft, maybe a Douglas DC-7 or a Boeing Stratocruiser. These were magnificent machines, the absolute pinnacle of piston engine technology. The DC-7 could cruise at about 365 miles per hour, and it was considered the fastest commercial airplane of its time. But here's what that meant for you as a passenger. Your transatlantic flight would take somewhere between 9 and 11 hours of actual flying time. And here's the catch. Most propeller planes didn't have enough range to make it all the way across the Atlantic in one go. So, your journey would include a stop in Gander, Newfoundland. Remember Gander? That little town on the eastern tip of Newfoundland became one of the busiest airports in the world during the 1950s, handling over 13,000 flights and 250,000 passengers every year. It was the crossroads of the world. You'd touch down in Gander in the middle of the night, climb off your plane in the bitter cold, and wait in the terminal while they refueled. Maybe you'd grab a cup of coffee, stretch your legs, use the restroom, then back on the plane for the second leg across the Atlantic. But the duration wasn't even the biggest challenge. Those propeller planes, for all their elegance and all the engineering brilliance that went into them, they vibrated. The four massive Wright R3350 engines on a DC-7, each with 18 cylinders, generating over 3,400 horsepower, created a constant, bone-deep rumble that you felt in your chest, in your teeth, in your very soul. The cabin was noisy too. Even with all the sound insulation engineers could devise, even with triple-paned windows in the noisiest sections, you had to raise your voice to have a conversation with the person sitting right next to you. By the time you reached Europe, you were exhausted, not just from the journey, but from fighting that constant vibration and noise for 10 or 11 hours. And the ride itself? Propeller planes typically cruised at around 20,000 to 22,000 feet, low enough that you felt every bump, every pocket of turbulent air, every storm system you couldn't fly over. The ride was often rough. If you were prone to air sickness, well, those little paper bags in the seat pocket weren't just decorative. Now, don't misunderstand. Flying in the 1950s had its own kind of magic. Passengers dressed in their finest clothes. Men wore suits and ties. Women wore their best dresses, jewelry, and heels. Flying was an event, something special, something you prepared for. The service was impeccable. Airlines like Pan Am served meals on fine china with real silverware. You might be served carved roast beef, lobster, even Chateaubriand from a cart wheeled down the aisle. Your drinks came in actual glassware. The seats were spacious, and the overall atmosphere tried to recreate the luxury of an ocean liner, or a fine restaurant. But it was expensive. Oh my goodness, was it expensive! A round-trip ticket from New York to Paris in the mid-1950s could cost you $450 to $500, sometimes more. A one-way ticket might run $250 to $300. And remember, this was at a time when the average American family earned maybe $5,000 a year. That means a single round-trip ticket to Europe could eat up nearly 10% of a family's entire annual income. Flying across the Atlantic was something most people could only dream about. Air travel was exclusive, reserved for the wealthy, for business executives, for diplomats, for movie stars. Regular working families? They went by ship if they crossed the ocean at all. And a ship would take you 4.5 to 5 days to cross the Atlantic. But even as passengers bounced and vibrated their way across the Atlantic in those propeller planes, a revolution was brewing. And it was happening in Seattle, Washington, in the factories and design studios of the Boeing company. The man behind this revolution was William McPherson Allen, and his story is one for the ages. Bill Allen wasn't an engineer. He wasn't a pilot. He was a lawyer, a corporate attorney who'd handled legal matters for Boeing since the 1920s. In 1945, when Boeing's president died suddenly near the end of World War II, the board of directors did something extraordinary. They offered the presidency to Bill Allen. And Allen, sensible, cautious Bill Allen, turned them down. He argued that he knew nothing about running an aerospace company. He wasn't qualified. He'd fail. But the board persisted, and eventually Allen accepted, taking over Boeing on September 1, 1945, right as World War II was ending and the company's massive military contracts were being canceled. Boeing went from employing thousands of workers to just a skeleton crew almost overnight. What Allen did next showed the kind of courage that builds empires. Instead of playing it safe, instead of just trying to survive, he made a bold decision. Boeing would build a jet-powered commercial transport, even though no airline had ordered one, even though the technology was unproven, even though it would cost millions. In May 1952, Boeing began work on what they called the Model 367-80, the Dash 80 for short. It was officially designated as just another variation of their C-97 military transport, but that was mostly for secrecy. In reality, it was something entirely new. Boeing invested $16 million of its own money, 2/3 of all the profit the company had made since the end of World War II, into building this prototype. There were no guarantees, no promises, just Bill Allen's conviction that this was the future. The Dash 80 featured swept wings mounted low on the fuselage, based on Boeing's B-47 and B-52 bombers. 4 Pratt & Whitney JT3 turbojet engines hung in pods beneath those wings, a revolutionary design that would become Boeing's signature. On July 15, 1954, test pilots Alvin "Tex" Johnston and Richard "Dix" Loesch took the Dash 80 into the sky for the first time. It was painted bright yellow and brown, not exactly subtle, and it flew beautifully. But Boeing still needed customers, and that's where another legendary figure enters our story. Juan Trippe, the founder and president of Pan American World Airways. Juan Trippe was a visionary. Born in 1899, he'd founded Pan Am in 1927 and built it into America's unofficial flag carrier, the airline that connected the United States to the world. Pan Am had pioneered transoceanic flight with flying boats. They'd introduced pressurized cabins with the Boeing 307. Trippe had a knack for seeing the future before anyone else. When Trippe saw what Boeing was developing, he understood immediately what it meant. This wasn't just a faster airplane. This was a tool that could democratize air travel, that could bring it within reach of regular people, not just the wealthy elite. Trippe approached Bill Allen with an audacious proposal. Pan Am would order Boeing's new jets, but only if Boeing would make them bigger, 6 inches wider in the fuselage to allow for 6 abreast seating instead of 5. More seats meant lower costs per passenger. Lower costs meant lower fares. Allen agreed, and on October 13, 1955, Pan Am ordered 20 of the new 707s at a cost of $269 million, the largest commercial aircraft order in history at that time. It was a massive gamble for both companies. Now, here's something important to understand. Boeing's 707 wasn't actually the first commercial jet airliner. That honor belonged to the British de Havilland Comet, which had entered service way back in May 1952, 6.5 years before Pan Am's first 707 flight. The Comet was a beautiful aircraft, sleek and modern with its 4 engines buried in the wing roots. When it began flying passengers from London to Johannesburg, South Africa, it caused a sensation. Here was an aircraft that could fly at 500 miles per hour at 35,000 feet, cutting travel times nearly in half. But then disaster struck, not once, but multiple times. In January 1954, a Comet broke apart in midair over the Mediterranean. Then another one disintegrated in April. All Comets were grounded. The investigation that followed was one of the most thorough in aviation history. Investigators even filled a Comet fuselage with water and pressurized it over and over, simulating thousands of flights, until they found the problem: metal fatigue around the square windows and rivet holes. The repeated cycles of pressurization and depressurization were causing microscopic cracks that eventually led to catastrophic failure. It was a phenomenon that wasn't fully understood at the time, a painful lesson learned at a terrible cost. The Comets were redesigned with oval windows, thicker skin, and other improvements. A new version, the Comet 4, would eventually return to service. But by then, Boeing and Douglas had learned from Britain's mistakes and were building better jets. The Comet disasters taught the aviation industry crucial lessons about pressurization, metal fatigue, and structural design, lessons that made every jet that followed, including the 707, safer and more reliable. By the fall of 1958, Pan Am had taken delivery of several Boeing 707s. The airline had spent months training pilots, flight attendants, mechanics, and ground crews. They'd modified airports, ordered new ground equipment, developed new procedures. Everything was ready. Pan Am scheduled the first transatlantic jet service for October 26, 1958. The flight would depart New York's Idlewild Airport, what we now call JFK, bound for Paris-Le Bourget, with one fuel stop in Gander. Now you might be wondering, why did a jet still need to stop in Gander? Wasn't the whole point of jets that they could fly farther? Well, here's the thing. That early model of the 707 couldn't carry a full load of passengers and enough fuel to cross the Atlantic non-stop, not when taking off from Idlewild. The airport's runways and Boeing's weight calculations meant they had to limit the fuel on board. So they'd still stop in Gander, but just briefly, just for fuel, not for a crew change or a long layover. The airplane assigned to this historic flight was N711PA, christened Clipper America. Pan Am had a tradition of naming their aircraft after the great clipper ships that once ruled the seas. This 707 would carry on that tradition into the jet age. On the evening of October 26th, as the sun set over New York, a remarkable scene unfolded at Idlewild Airport. Photographers swarmed. Reporters took notes. A military band played patriotic music. It was a spectacle, a celebration, a moment everyone recognized as historic. 111 passengers, regular paying customers, not just airline executives and dignitaries, walked across a literal red carpet to board Clipper America. Among them was a 7-year-old boy named Lauren Hopkins and his mother, Vera. They'd won their seats through a cereal box contest, never imagining they'd end up being part of aviation history. There were Boeing engineers and their families, people who'd helped build this very airplane. There was actress Greer Garson. There were businessmen heading to Europe, tourists beginning long-anticipated vacations, and ordinary people who'd saved up for this one special journey. The crew consisted of 11 people, pilots, flight engineers, and 7 flight attendants. One of those attendants was Jay Corrin, called in at the last minute when Pan Am decided to add an extra person to the crew. Corrin, who was 26 years old, would later write about this flight in his memoir. At approximately 6:53 p.m. Eastern Time, Clipper America began its takeoff roll. The 4 Pratt & Whitney JT3C turbojet engines, each producing 13,500 pounds of thrust with water injection, roared to life. Even the experienced crew members were startled by the power. Jay Corrin, sitting in a rear jump seat with 2 other attendants, later described the moment. Even more startling was the unexpected vibration and violent roar of the jet engines as we gathered speed for our leap up into the night. The 3 of them grasped hands and stared wide-eyed at one another in disbelief. And then, liftoff. The 707 climbed into the darkening sky, its swept wings catching the last rays of sunlight, leaving behind the lights of New York below. Once they reached cruising altitude, 32,000 feet, far higher than any propeller plane could fly, something remarkable happened. Something that would define the jet age and change how we thought about distance and travel. The vibration stopped. The noise dropped to a whisper. Passengers who'd flown dozens of times on propeller planes looked at each other in amazement. 7-year-old Lauren Hopkins, overwhelmed by the strangeness of it all, asked his mother why the airplane was moving so slowly. A stewardess overheard him and reported this to the captain, who came out and invited the boy into the cockpit. There, the captain explained, they weren't moving slowly at all. They were flying at nearly 600 miles per hour, but it felt like they were standing still. That was the miracle of the jet. That was the revolution that would change everything. Throughout the cabin, passengers experienced something unprecedented. The ride was smooth, smoother than anyone had imagined possible. There was no vibration, no constant rumble, no need to shout to be heard. You could set a coin on the tray table and it would stay there, balanced, as if the plane weren't moving at all. The flight attendants served dinner on Pan Am's fine china with real silverware. There were hot meals prepared in 4 galleys, wines served in stemware, linen tablecloths. But now, for the first time, passengers could actually enjoy the meal without fighting turbulence and vibration. They could have a normal conversation. They could read. They could relax. The cabin lighting could be adjusted to simulate different times of day, pale pink like dawn, then bright for midday, then dark blue for nighttime. It added to the surreal quality of the experience, this sense that you'd somehow stepped outside of normal time and space. After a brief stop in Gander for refueling, much quicker than the old days, just enough time to top off the tanks, Clipper America continued across the Atlantic. The total flying time was about 7 hours, but with the Gander stop, the whole journey took 8 hours and 41 minutes. They landed at Paris-Le Bourget Airport on the morning of October 27th. The passengers, stepping off the plane, were astonished to realize they felt rested. They weren't exhausted. They weren't worn out from hours of noise and vibration. Some of them felt like they'd just taken a comfortable train ride, not crossed an ocean. Within days of that first flight, everything changed. Pan Am began daily jet service across the Atlantic. Other airlines scrambled to order their own jets, not just from Boeing, but from Douglas, which was building the DC-8. By December 1958, National Airlines had leased a 707 from Pan Am to operate the first domestic jet service between New York and Miami. Then, in January 1959, American Airlines began transcontinental jet service between New York and Los Angeles. Within months, jets were everywhere. And here's what happened to ticket prices. They fell. Juan Trippe had been right. In April 1958, just before the jets arrived, Pan Am had introduced economy class service across the Atlantic. A first-class round-trip ticket from New York to London cost $783. Tourist class was $567. But economy class, with closer seat spacing and fewer amenities, was just $453. Once the jets came online with their much higher capacity, prices fell even further. Air travel was still expensive by today's standards, but it was finally becoming accessible to middle-class families. A schoolteacher could save up and fly to Europe. A young couple could afford a honeymoon in Paris. The jet didn't just shrink the world, it democratized it. The impact rippled out in ways no one had fully anticipated. Airports had to be completely rebuilt to handle jets. Runways needed to be longer and stronger. Terminal buildings needed to be redesigned. New ground equipment had to be developed. Air traffic control systems needed upgrading to handle the faster aircraft and the increasing number of flights. Weather forecasting became more important as jets flew higher and faster. The entire infrastructure of aviation had to evolve. International business changed overnight. Executives could now fly to Europe for a meeting and be back within days instead of weeks. Companies could maintain closer relationships with overseas offices. Global trade expanded. Tourism exploded. Suddenly, regular Americans could actually afford to see the world. The jet set became a cultural phenomenon, people who could hop on a plane to Rome or London on a whim. Travel agencies boomed, hotels expanded, entire economies in Europe and other destinations adapted to handle the influx of American tourists. Even the way we thought about time and distance changed. Europe wasn't across the ocean anymore. It was just a few hours away. The Pacific, once a vast barrier, became crossable in a single day. Australia went from being on the other side of the world to being, well, still far, but suddenly reachable. And those refueling stops in Gander? Within a few years, as Boeing and other manufacturers developed longer-range jets with more powerful engines, they became unnecessary. By the early 1960s, jets were flying non-stop from New York to Paris, from Los Angeles to Tokyo, from San Francisco to Hong Kong. Gander went from being the busiest airport in the world to a quiet regional facility, bypassed by progress. The propeller planes, those magnificent DC-7s and super constellations that had seemed so modern just a few years earlier, were suddenly obsolete. Airlines couldn't retire them fast enough. Some were converted to cargo haulers, others were scrapped. The jet had rendered them as old-fashioned as steam locomotives. But there was another side to this story, one we don't always remember when we think about the glamour of the jet age. Those flight attendants we mentioned, they were part of the story too. In 1958, becoming a flight attendant, they were called stewardesses then, was one of the most coveted jobs for young women. Airlines hired only 3 to 5% of applicants. You had to be between 21 and 26, unmarried, meet specific height and weight requirements, and have what they called the right look. The pay wasn't spectacular, maybe $255 to $355 a month. But the opportunity to see the world, to fly on these amazing new jets, to be part of this revolution, made it incredibly attractive. Young women competed fiercely for these positions. But here's what we didn't talk about much back then. These women faced rigid rules. They couldn't be married. If they got pregnant, they were immediately fired. They had weight limits and were weighed regularly. They had to wear girdles, actual rubber compression garments, as part of their uniform, even in pressurized cabins at altitude, which could cause serious health problems. The glamour was real, but it came at a price. These women were pioneers in their own way, breaking out of traditional roles, seeing the world, living independently. but they were also constrained by the social expectations of the 1950s, treated as much as decorative objects as professional workers. And passengers? That formal dress code we mentioned, men in suits, women in their finest, it wasn't written down anywhere. It was simply understood that flying was an event, something special. You dressed up out of respect for the experience and for your fellow passengers. The loss of that formality in later decades is something many people from that era mourn. There was a grace to it, a sense of occasion. Flying meant something. It wasn't just transportation. It was an experience. Let's zoom out for a moment and remember what else was happening in the world that year. 1958 was the height of the Cold War. The Soviet Union had shocked the world by launching Sputnik in 1957, beating America into space. In response, the United States launched Explorer 1 in January 1958, beginning the space race in earnest. NASA would be founded later that year. President Dwight Eisenhower was in the White House, dealing with international crises from Lebanon to Berlin. The threat of nuclear war hung over everything. Yet here was Pan Am, launching a commercial service that would connect East and West, bring people together, make the world smaller. In France, Charles de Gaulle had just returned to power, establishing the Fifth Republic. In Cuba, Fidel Castro was waging his revolution against Batista. In Britain, the Notting Hill race riots exposed deep social divisions. The world was changing rapidly, sometimes violently, and into this moment of uncertainty and upheaval came this technological marvel, this jet airplane that promised to bring people together, to shrink distances, to make the world more connected. Let's return to some of the people in our story and see what became of them. Bill Allen, that reluctant lawyer who became Boeing's president, continued leading the company until 1968. Under his leadership, Boeing developed not just the 707, but also the 727, the 737, and the giant 747. He took Boeing from near bankruptcy at the end of World War II to being the world's leading aircraft manufacturer. He died in 1985 at age 85, having witnessed the complete transformation of air travel. Juan Trippe remained president of Pan Am until 1968. He continued pushing the boundaries, ordering the first 747s from Boeing, convinced that even bigger jets were the future. He was right about that too. Trippe died in 1981, having built Pan Am into one of the most recognized brands in the world. Young Lauren Hopkins, that 7-year-old boy who won his seat in a cereal contest, grew up with an amazing story to tell. He was the only passenger from that historic first flight who attended Pan Am's 25th anniversary commemoration of the event in 1983. Jay Corrin, the flight attendant called in at the last minute, stayed with Pan Am for 40 years, eventually writing a memoir about his experiences. He was also aboard Pan Am's inaugural 747 flight in 1970, making him one of the few people to be part of both revolutionary moments in commercial aviation. He died in 2019. Clipper America itself, that Boeing 707 registration N711PA, flew for Pan Am for years before eventually being converted to cargo service and then scrapped. But by then, it had fulfilled its destiny. It had shown the world what was possible.